On this episode of Public Scrutiny, we'll be looking into former Speaker John Bercow's activities and character during his time in office.
You made enemies by doing that, particularly
absolutely.
of those in government, and particularly one then leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
There has been significant media coverage of late regarding former Speaker John Bercow not being recommended for a peerage. It's because I've seen him talking about it in a seemingly endless amount of interviews as though currently engaged in a PR exercise that I'll be giving him a bit of scrutiny today. We'll begin with this interview on Sky as a reference point. I've adjusted the chronology of it as I want to cover the allegations of bullying first.
Just want to discuss that relationship because it was crucial between the Speaker and the Leader of the House. And this is just some of how you've described what seemed a very, very difficult relationship, that she had a near pathological hatred of you, feeble and sinister. And this is very interesting. Just tell us a bit about this. I took care always to be accompanied so that there was an independent view on what was said by whom and when. This is when you met with her and you made sure that she had someone on her side. Independent witnesses, but why?
Okay, so we're straight into an equation. Him versus her. One person's word against another. That's why we have to take this on balance. Was it him who insisted that there was someone else there, or was it her? He's the one with the allegations against him. I've not heard anyone accusing Andrea Leadsom of being a bully. So for all we know, it could have been her that said she wasn't going to see him alone. But how would that look? If he was being a bully, it's unlikely that it would be him who was insisting that there should be witnesses. But it would look bad, given the accusations against him, if somebody wouldn't go to see him without there being someone else present. So it's probably best to portray it like it was a mutual thing.
There was no trust between us, and I was advised at one point by a senior person in government that she was very hostile and that she was looking to foment trouble for me. And that individual, who said this to me in confidence, and I will respect it, said to me, "Mr. Speaker, can I offer you a word of advice?" And I said, "Please do." And he said, "If I were you, I A, wouldn't rise to the bait if she tries to wind you up, and B," he said, "if you have meetings with her, because of the importance of it being clear subsequently who said what to whom, I would advise you to be accompanied."
You also address other allegations, the allegations of bullying made while you were there by one of your clerks, Kate Ems, and your private secretary, Angus Sinclair. And are you mystified? Because you obviously deny the allegations. Are you mystified as to why they made them?
Yes, frankly, I was astonished.
The office of Black Rod is best known for its odd role in the state opening of Parliament.
Black Rod, open the door!
Black Rod!
But the job is, for the rest of the year, a senior post in running Parliament. It brought David Leakey into close contact with John Bercow.
He creates a climate of intimidation and fear amongst a whole group of people. That's MPs, some journalists, it may not be very many, but certainly members, and certainly the staff. I can recall often people being very concerned about whether or not to take an issue or when to take an issue to the Speaker. I have my own personal experience of an issue needed to be resolved. A meeting was set up. I was to present or lead on an issue, and other staff didn't make the meeting.
Right. Why was that?
They were fearful that Mr. Bercow wasn't going to like the recommendation that was being put to him.
So you didn't want to be there when he was going to get bad news?
I think some people have felt that, yeah.
So can you give us some examples of what's happened?
Sitting, actually, I can't remember whether it was in his office or in his outer office, talking to his staff and others about the seating arrangements for a high-profile visit in Westminster Hall. And people had various different ideas about which group should sit where. And Mr. Bercow joined the discussion, and he just took exception, complete exception, to what was being proposed and discussed. And the red mist descended, and he banged the table and yelled and was highly insulting to me, personally, including calling me an anti-Semite. He's Jewish himself, I think, for which he apologised afterwards.
I assume the apology was for the comment, but still, it looks like he's only too happy to use the trump card when he doesn't like what's going on.
For me, it's not a big deal. I've been shouted at by other people. For me, it's water off a duck's back. But if that happened to someone else on the staff who wasn't used to that sort of treatment, that is, by any definition, bullying. It's intimidating. It's unreasonable. It's disproportionate. Then there is the wider issue, not what goes on behind closed doors with individual staff or members, but what happens in public, in the chamber. And there you only have to look at the TV coverage, the live TV coverage of proceedings in the House of Commons chamber, and you can see examples of the sorts of complaints people have made about his behaviour in private. So intimidation, mimicking people, mocking people. People can make a judgment about whether that is acceptable behaviour and the standard which we want set in public life by our Parliament and by our Speaker in our Parliament. And my own personal view is that I don't think it does meet the standard.
I will say this, it's become very apparent to me that Bercow does not hide his contempt for people. He's happy to make public some very insulting comments about those he interacted with professionally.
So we've been struck by silence on both sides of the House about this issue. There's been a real reluctance among MPs to try to address the Speaker's conduct.
It's very difficult to challenge the Speaker because he is so powerful. And I know from what MPs on all sides of the House have said to me, and that is that they wouldn't risk complaining about or voting against the Speaker because, to use the words that some of them have used with me, he would be vindictive and not call them or perhaps even be rude to them. And there's no point in being an MP in the chamber if you never attract the eye of the Speaker and have a chance to have your say. And so MPs are fearful of speaking out against him.
This, of course, has an inverse. It makes it more likely that people would be extra nice to the Speaker because it's in their interests to get along with him. So Bercow has everything stacked in his favour. People are nice to him by default, but there's no onus on him to be nice in return. He has the power hand, and as the former Black Rod said, making complaints against him is bad for business.
And I think quite rightly, there hasn't been any movement to censure the Speaker or even to remove him because the tribal politics are such that it's perceived, it's not perceived, it's widely acknowledged that the Labour Party obtain a considerable political benefit from Mr Bercow's treatment of the Tory front benches, for example.
The interesting thing about this is, John Bercow was a Tory himself, so even if he were partisan, which he should not be, he was actually biased against his own former party.
And that therefore, why would the opposition seek to remove a Speaker who serves them well? And without the support of the opposition, then a movement against the Speaker will fail.
Did you make any attempts to intervene about Mr Bercow's behaviour when you were in office?
No, except that I reported what had happened to the people to whom I reported. But for me, it was just a sort of ridiculous event. It wasn't troublesome for me. I didn't feel like a victim. But then that's me.
You understood how other people could feel like that?
I certainly understand how other people could. But I was not on the House of Commons staff and therefore not in the mix of what was going on in the House of Commons.
Why have you chosen to speak out at this moment now?
Well, for the very simple reason that when I saw the terms of reference for the inquiry, Given my own experiences and the reports of other people who've made allegations, I thought that it was inappropriate that individual investigations were ruled out, appeared to be ruled out of the inquiry. And I thought that was wrong, and I thought it was right to say something about it. And I felt that because I'd been on the receiving end of behaviour which seems to have been meted out to other people, I was in a position to draw attention to this, and I think it's right that it should be looked at.
Order.
Last autumn, the Speaker gave a statement on standards of behaviour.
Let me make it clear. There must be zero tolerance of sexual harassment or bullying here at Westminster or elsewhere.
For him to stand up and say that, given how he treats the people around him, is remarkable. I wonder for whose consumption was this statement made?
I don't know if you've seen the footage of Mr. Bercow last year speaking about how he's going to have zero tolerance for bullying and harassment.
Hypocrisy is the thought that comes to mind.
What do you think should happen next?
Well, that is for Parliament to decide. It's not for me to decide or even recommend. But we live in an open society, and if people have got a complaint or a point to make, like me, and I'm just a voter, an ordinary taxpayer like everybody else, I'm having my say. And I just don't think Mr. Bercow matches up to the standards that I expect of a Speaker in our Parliament, and the sort of standards that we would expect to see applied, whether it's by a government minister. And recently, a number of government ministers have resigned for breaches of the code, and the question one has to ask is this up there with them? I think it needs a serious look at, and Parliament needs to examine whether what's going on there matches the standards in public life.
Brutalised is the word used 3 times, I think.
Total and utter rubbish from start to finish. I noticed how hesitant David Leakey was in developing his case, as though he was choosing his words carefully.
There's nothing wrong with choosing words carefully, especially given the nature of the accusations. It's not a small matter, so damn right people choose their words carefully. It's going on the record.
Total and utter rubbish. First point is that David Leakey didn't work for me. He wasn't employed by me. He wasn't an employee of the House of Commons. He worked in and was the protocol officer of the House of Lords. He is in absolutely no position whatsoever to comment on my relations with my parliamentary colleagues, of which he is completely and utterly ignorant. He doesn't know what my relations were with my clerks. He has absolutely no intelligence on those matters whatsoever.
He has had first-hand experience with you. That's enough to form an impression. And then there are the accounts of those who do work with and spend time around you. There are multiple accusations levelled at you, so you don't get to dismiss this in its entirety just because he works in another department. People do talk to each other.
What we've got here is somebody who left the House, who is thrashing around, desperate to remain relevant, popping up at every turn, trying to make himself seem very important, very centre stage, very at the heart of things in the way that I went about my work. None of those things, Dermot, is true.
Funny thing, when I heard this the first time, I thought that what Bercow was saying about the former Black Rod was actually the very thing that Bercow was doing himself. Projecting. But the takeaway is, if you look at his facial expression and the force behind his words and the words he's using, and then look at the smile on his face as he speaks, it's clear that the smile is a superficial mask that he wears to conceal the nastiness beneath. Imagine him stood right in front of you, staring right into your eyes, making threats but speaking quietly. If you were standing 30 feet away from him, you might see the smile and think he was being nice. Let's watch it again. Especially the bit where he says, "None of those things, Dermot." It's not a happy smile, is it? Yet it's on his face most of the time.
What we've got here is somebody who left the House, who is thrashing around, desperate to remain relevant, popping up at every turn, trying to make himself seem very important, very centre stage, very at the heart of things in the way that I went about my work. None of those things, Dermot, is true. Absurdly, preposterously, he's turning up years later a couple of years after he left the House, commenting on matters that he can't possibly know about because he'd already left. He said something about my relations with Andrea Leadsom in May 2018, something that I'd allegedly said to her and caused her to cry. He wouldn't know. He'd left 3 months before. The guy is a know-nothing. He hasn't the foggiest idea what he's talking about. He was deeply hostile to me.
Yeah, it's funny. Now there's two people who are deeply hostile to you. Why was it that they became hostile? I suppose they are horrible, nasty people, but I don't really hear them insulting people in public. I hear you insulting people, though. But they are the ones who are hostile.
He's entitled to his views, but on the matter of bullying, he suffers from the disadvantage of being 100% wrong.
Well, that would mean that there was no truth whatsoever to the allegations, and that butter would not melt in your mouth, and that he was lying in order to cause you trouble because he doesn't like you, just like the others.
When the allegations first surfaced nearly 2 years ago, I think it was in March 2018, at the time, nothing was said publicly by an individual to the effect that she or he had been bullied. Subsequently, a couple of months later, somebody came forward and said that he felt unfairly treated by me. I can say only two things. First of all, I absolutely insist that I have never bullied anyone, anywhere, at any time.
I was in the Navy for about 30 years. And very broadly, sort of 10 years in submarines, 10 years staff and training people, and about 10 years doing other things.
So this guy served his time in the Navy, often a high-pressure environment. He's used to obeying orders without question, and given that he trained other naval personnel, it does suggest an above-average level of competence.
So in 2005, though,
I came to an end of my time in the Navy and had to find something to do, and there was an advertisement that attracted me, and that was the job of Speaker Secretary at the House of Commons. I think our problem was that he would not communicate. It was as if we had to best guess what he wanted, and that will always lead to mistakes. And this happened a number of times, and it seemed to be more frequent. And the Speaker responded in a way that I can only say is a form of bullying, and that is to show anger, to thump the table, to say that somebody has failed in front of others. It seemed to get more frequent. It became very difficult to try and communicate through that. And of course, what builds up is a sort of spell of failure. We're not doing what we're meant to be doing. And clearly, he's angry about it.
so that would get to you.
It gets to you because you want to avoid that anger. Because sometimes, he would denigrate you in a particular way through mimicking or yet again something has gone wrong. Sometimes he would say in front of, somebody who was working for you that, that your boss had failed. And that is quite hard. It seemed to be over-the-top anger. I'm not sure he was completely in control. The arms would wave around. I mean, there was one afternoon I was working at my desk and he came in and he was absolutely furious about something. He asked for some information from another part of the house and it had been very slow in coming. And I prodded for an early resolution of this and he knew that, but he held me responsible. And there was a tirade of how I'd let him down. It was quite the worst thing, a lot of bad language. And suddenly his mobile phone, which he'd been holding, was flung on the desk in front of me, and it broke into a lot of bits. And it was a pretty dramatic moment. And he left the office shortly afterwards. It's an anger, a visible frustration. I don't say it was thrown at me. I got hit with bits of it.
Given how Bercow is in public, it's not really a stretch for him to behave like that if he thinks that no one's watching. I've no reason to doubt this guy at this point.
So you've described to us being undermined in front of your own staff, being shouted at, rages, phone smashing. It must have taken a toll on you.
I couldn't see what he was after other than perhaps me moving on. And I found that the temper and the sort of bullying method was, it just lowered your horizons. So that's the worst thing about it, because it is demeaning. And perhaps one of the worst aspects of it is from time to time you would hear yourself mimicked. And your thought then is that really how he sees me? It removes the dignity, and I think we all know that every job in the land has to have some dignity. Well, I felt at the time that then the dignity had been removed. You would walk to work with a heavy heart. The horizon suddenly was low. It was not a good feeling. It was a feeling of failure.
How do you feel about having signed that non-disclosure agreement?
I thought at the time that it was keeping the good name of the house.
How do you feel about it now?
It's in the public interest to know why I left. Yes, it breaks that non-disclosure agreement, but it's the truth. There was bullying. So this flat denial that it didn't happen is just not the case.
Yeah, Bercow shouldn't have denied everything in totality. His character is on show, people know what he's like, he's denying the existence of his own personality. If he'd have said something like, "I'm very passionate about things, sometimes I over-emote and people can take it the wrong way, etc." That would be more credible, but a complete denial is not.
And I don't think the House has done enough yet to solve it. It's right across the board, and clearly it's an issue that must be resolved.
Former colleagues of Mr Sinclair have corroborated the toll that it took on him. Witnesses have also confirmed that he had raised concerns with senior managers about what was being done to him.
Did you bring this to anyone's attention?
Yes, I did. I felt, look, I'm not getting this right. I need to bring it to the attention of my effective line manager, my boss, and that is the Clerk of the House. So on a number of occasions I went to him and explained what had happened, and I revealed to him that I didn't think I was producing the goods. But on the other hand, I thought the Speaker's behaviour, and the bullying in particular, was way over the top, and it was making things difficult.
It's worth noting that this guy went to see the Clerk of the House on a number of occasions.
Now, as to complaint, well, there's no real route for the Speaker's Secretary to do that. The Speaker appoints his personal staff.
So you're in this grim position where you're unhappy, the Speaker seems to be unhappy, and your line manager can't seem to do anything about this. How does it resolve itself?
May 2010 election, Speaker re-elected, and re-elected as Speaker by the House. And very shortly after that, he asked if I could come through, because he wanted to talk through a number of things. And I thought to myself, well, actually, maybe this is a fresh start. We can, actually have a chat and see how things in this new session could be better. And when I went in, he was, very charming and gracious, and I sat down, and he said almost immediately, look, I'm going to redesign the office and make some changes, and I don't have a part for you in that change. I've been working with the Clerk of the House for some time on this matter.
Bercow switched it around. Even though it was the Secretary that spoke to the Clerk about the Speaker, Bercow switched it so that it was the Speaker who spoke to the Clerk about the Secretary. This is why I said earlier about Andrea Ledson. We don't know whether it was her that went to see him without a witness or him not seeing her without a witness. Like I said though, why would a bully want witnesses?
And so, in a way, I thought, well, actually, that's quite a relief.
So they gave you something they called a compulsory early retirement, which was part of which was an £85,000 lump sum.
Yes, yeah.
But there were conditions attached to that.
I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement that I wouldn't make complaint about my departure, nor talk about it to the press.
Why do you think they gave you that NDA? I mean, that's quite an unusual thing for the House.
I can only think it was because of the detail of what had happened. The bullying and the manner of my leaving.
So, when at the start of the video Bercow said that he was astonished by the allegations, this wasn't true. He knew perfectly well what was happening because he made the guy sign a non-disclosure agreement. What was it, John, that you did not want your former secretary to disclose if there was no truth whatsoever to the allegations?
This is not the only case involving Mr. Bercow, who made a statement on this topic to the House last year.
Let me make it clear. There must be zero tolerance of sexual harassment or bullying here at Westminster or elsewhere.
Newsnight has previously reported on the case of Kate Ems, Mr. Sinclair's replacement. Ms. Ems had to step away from the Speaker's office after less than a year. Her managers were told she had post-traumatic stress disorder. Mr. Bercow has denied bullying her.
Add another one to the list, and these are just the ones who have come forward. Can you imagine getting the job of secretary to the Speaker of the House of Commons? Of all of the jobs in the world to have, it's probably one of the better ones. And yet she left after a year citing post-traumatic stress disorder. I suppose she's lying as well, John.
We reported that managers in the House were told that Kate Ems, your successor, got post-traumatic stress disorder from that job. How did you respond to that?
Well, that really concerned me because I think if I'd actually said to myself, I'm not signing this non-disclosure agreement, or I'd put in a complaint, or I'd done actually what anybody should do if they've suffered a bullying incident, is to speak out and get it resolved, then she might not have been put in that position. You know, I'd signed a cover-up and in a cynical way, I'd been paid to do it. And, you know, that's not a good feeling.
Following Newsnight's previous reports, the House of Commons has agreed to start an inquiry into the treatment of the House's apolitical staff. Westminster has a problem with both bullying and harassment.
However, it's not an investigation into specific individuals, so Bercow is unlikely to be touched by it.
What kind of a mark does it leave on you?
I spent quite a lot of time not sleeping and revisiting things. And as the years go by, you know, that eases. You do remember every detail. There's always, I think, because of the spell inflicted, a sense of failure. And, you know, that's not enjoyable. It's not a good memory. I used to say to myself, I wouldn't really want to go back to the House of Commons because I don't want to meet my own ghost. But I have a huge respect for it as an institution and the House of Commons service, which for 5 years I was proud to be part of. But no, it's not a good experience. And what you guys have exposed is that things are really no better. And that makes me angry, and that's why I want to speak out. And the same old things and memories and detail are all coming back as if they were yesterday. I kept notes at the time, and I've not read them in the past 8 years, but I've been looking at them now, and it brings it home just how difficult it was.
He's a functionary, a servant, but he kept records. I hope he sells it to a newspaper.
So, just so we're clear, a prominent elected individual bullies a member of public staff. That member of staff is paid off £85,000, asked to sign an NDA. Is that a fair reading of what happened?
It's a reading of it, and a pretty accurate one.
A spokesman for the Speaker's office said, Mr. Speaker strenuously denies there is any substance to any of these allegations. Mr. Speaker has a superb team of dedicated, effective and long-serving staff, 5 of whom have worked for him very happily for a combined total of over 40 years.
I've always been an outsider, and really from my earliest years I felt that I was an outsider.
Given your personality, that's hardly a surprise, John.
Trying to get in, trying to forge a path, trying to make my way. And ironically, I ended up, of course, as Speaker as a member of the establishment, Dermot, but I certainly wasn't chosen by the establishment, and I think that also won't be denied or argued against by anybody.
It was before you became an MP, but you stayed associated with it. You joined the Monday Club, this right-wing conservative association, and you're very frank about it in the book. You talk about that repeatedly as a shameful period for you personally. Now, let's tell people about the Monday Club, and you were inspired in part by the works, the speeches, the thoughts of Enoch Powell, who your dad originally introduced you to.
It was a great mistake. I was probably a rather insecure and uncertain young man. I hadn't quite worked out what my future would be. I was probably a bit unsure of myself. I had been afflicted by a number of problems in childhood. I was physically a rather unimpressive character. And whether the sort of machismo of right-wing politics at the time particularly appealed to me, it's difficult to say. I'm trying to look back and decide.
Anti-immigration, anti-Europe.
It was a terrible mistake, and not just a mistake in the sense that in the end it didn't serve me well.
How about this? You're a globalist who wanted to get into politics, but you knew that the Labour Party wouldn't have you, so you ingratiated yourself with the Tories and made sure that they knew you were one of them by espousing their policies in order to work your way into Parliament. Once you got there, you began to disown the Tories, even though you were a member of their party, and once you became Speaker, you were free to act as the globalist you always have been. So I wouldn't say that the Monday Club didn't serve you well. Without it, you would not have gotten to where you were.
But much more importantly than that, I feel to this day terribly ashamed that as a young man I joined what was essentially, to all intents and purposes, a racist pressure group on the fringes of the Conservative Party, and I gave encouragement and succour to people who were promoting racist messages.
Some of those people you mentioned, I mean, you said it was racist. Some of them still in Parliament, and some of them are still on the right of the Conservative Party. Are there racists in the Conservative Party now?
Well, I'm not thinking of anybody in particular in the Conservative Parliamentary Party. I think that racism is a scourge which afflicts society as a whole. I think race relations are much better now, Dermot, than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. But I think it is a continuing challenge across the political parties. We've heard quite a lot over the last year or two about the difficulty and the real evil of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I must say I've never encountered anti-Semitism from a member of the Labour Party, but I have encountered anti-Semitism from some members of my former party, the Conservative Party, and there's certainly an issue of Islamophobia in the Conservative Party. So
he hates the Tories. The Labour Party have been mired in anti-Semitism claims for over a year. He never saw it though, but he saw anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the Tories, probably because it's the Tories who refused to recommend him for an honour.
I think really it is best for politicians in all of the parties to take a mature, level-headed and constructive approach to this subject, to accept that it does afflict both of the major parties and perhaps others, and needs to be addressed.
David Cameron. Now, I think we've got one of the quotations you have about David Cameron there. Are we back to class here with David Cameron? You give us very much a sense, and many people seem to pick it up as well during his years as Prime Minister, that he was rather entitled, born with a silver trolley service in his mouth, sniffy, supercilious and deeply snobbish, an opportunist lightweight. You didn't really rate David Cameron.
No, not particularly.
I assert that John Bercow had no respect for the conventions of the office of Speaker. He's supposed to be neutral. To my memory, I don't ever recall any other Speaker publicly insulting members of the House, let alone those serving in government, and more so members of his own former party. It would be highly improper to do so, but not for Bercow.
I think he's very able. I think he's very fleet of foot. He's very articulate. He can be charming. Now and again, on big occasions, on the occasion, for example, of the Bloody Sunday inquiry report, he performed with great skill and sensitivity and dexterity. But if I have an overall criticism of him, I dare say he's got various criticisms of me, it would be that he was relentlessly tactical rather than strategic. He didn't have an overall vision for the country. He tended just to fly by the seat of his pants and to work on the basis that because he was skillful on his feet and because he had a good turn of phrase, he would hack it. And famously, of course, he was asked about the EU referendum. He said he would win, and I think somebody sort of said to him, why? And he said, well, I always do.
Theresa May took over, and, Theresa May, perhaps given a hospital pass, the poison chalice, who knows? But this is your assessment, in part, of Theresa May, and a lot of it was character. Decent, but as wooden as your average coffee table, dull as ditch water, lacking in an ounce of small talk, devoid of any spontaneity or natural fluency, let alone charisma.
If he's happy to say stuff like that in public, do you believe that he wouldn't go further in private? I don't, not for 1 second.
Discuss, because she required a lot of what she lacked there, did she not, for dealing with the situation she inherited?
Yes, I mean, that is the encapsulation of what I think of her. I think she's a decent person. I think she's hard-working. I think she's public-spirited. I think that all of those things are true, and I think that it is incredibly important to be a successful political leader to have the quality of political imagination. And I think Theresa May lacked political imagination.
Boris Johnson, of course, not too long in post, already won that thumping majority in the general election. Your assessment so far of him, and you know Boris Johnson quite well. I know you mentioned in the book beating him rather comprehensively at tennis. We'll get on to that in a moment. But let's just get some of your assessment. At his occasional best, a passably adequate politician, he's disproportionately preoccupied with whatever serves the cause of advancement for Boris Johnson. In it for himself, John?
Well, he's hugely ambitious. He's been motivated throughout his career by the absolute unyielding determination to get to the top of the tree, and he has succeeded. Moreover, credit where it's due, he's proved so far to be a very successful campaigner in getting office. However, the real challenge is, having got power, what does he do with it? Will he deploy statecraft, not just for his benefit, but for the benefit of the United Kingdom? And there, I think one has to say, the jury is out. There were people who thought that if he got a big majority, and this is an almost humongous majority of 80 that he's got, that he would then rat on the hard-line Brexiteers and, in a sense, pivot to a soft Brexit position. And so far that hasn't happened. I mean, it's very much the opening salvos at the moment that are being fired, but in these opening statements and speeches he's making, he seems to be signalling very clearly that he does not want regulatory alignment with the European Union in the name of maximising market access. He wants to diverge from the EU and have the fullest possible scope to forge free trade deals with the rest of the world. He can do that, but if he does that, A, those deals will take some considerable time to forge, and B, if he does diverge, the chance of getting a satisfactory trade deal with the European Union seems to me somewhat reduced.
My opinion of Bercow is that he's a nasty little man. I'm sure he believes that a smile is enough to conceal an entire angry, scowling face, and I don't doubt for a second that he wielded whatever power he had like it was his own. He has an overtly confrontational personality, which is probably not appropriate for a humble functionary, and as multiple allegations have been made, it becomes increasingly hard to believe that there's no truth at all to any of them, especially when he's happy to insult people in public. And if it were only about the bullying, unpleasant though that is, one could rest on convention and give him a knighthood. But it wasn't just bullying. There's also the matter of his conduct as it relates to Britain's exit from the EU.
Could all have been very different. Let's just focus down now on that period after the 2017 general election. You've talked about that hung parliament, how you interpreted it, how Theresa May, the then Prime Minister, interpreted it very differently. Did you see it as your job to try to thwart the approach that Theresa May and her government were trying to take on Brexit, or were you simply informed by the fact that there was no overall majority in Parliament and that therefore all parliamentarians had to have a say?
The latter. It absolutely wasn't my mission to thwart her or to thwart Brexit any more than it would have been my mission to facilitate or implement Brexit. That wasn't for the Speaker to do. The role of the Speaker in such a situation is to facilitate the House. And what I sought at every turn throughout my speakership, not merely in relation to Brexit, but in respect of every other subject, was to let the House breathe. The particular difference post-2017's election was that the Parliament was hung. The government had no overall majority. And what from time to time I had to say to ministers and to the government chief whip was, look, it's not my responsibility to protect you from the absence of a majority. Now, I accept that I interpreted the rules in some cases differently from the way in which they'd been interpreted before.
It would seem, John, that in nearly every respect you interpreted rules differently. Speakers over the years have respected the office. You didn't. You effectively redesigned your own job. You did things that no previous speaker would have even contemplated. You took the traditions and conventions of speaker and you threw them away. You moved into the job like it was your own house. The speakership, as it had been for centuries, ended with you. You were partisan.
there were people, Dermot, who said, what John Bercow has done is unprecedented, to which my answer was, yes, the circumstances are unprecedented. I broke no rule, and in respect of the so-called Benn Act, passed by non-government MPs to protect Britain from a no-deal Brexit unless Parliament approved it.
At the time, the House was infested with Remainers, you being one of them. There was absolutely no way that the House would vote for no deal, and you knew it. And on that matter, you sought to remove power from the government and place it in the hands of the whole House, a lot of whom did not want us to leave the EU. And after successive votes, it was clear that the majority of the House were not likely to accept any deal. It was not your place to stop a no-deal Brexit. The House is there to represent the will of the people. Many people believed that a deal would be Brexit in name only, and that no deal was likely to be the only way we would actually leave with a clean break. That's what you wanted to stop. The majority of people voted to leave the EU. The law was with or without a deal. You helped those that did not want us to leave the EU, and in doing so you placed yourself in opposition to the public. You are supposed to be a public servant. Those Remain MPs either ended up standing down in advance or losing their seats at the election.
What I was doing there was letting the House breathe. My judgment was that I should let the House do what the House wanted to do.
But you made enemies.
As I see it, John Bercow never respected the office, traditions or conventions of Speaker, and he stood in opposition to the public after the referendum. And just in case he was unsure of the public's view on things, it was confirmed by Boris's landslide election win last December. John Bercow chose the wrong side. The fact is, the Speaker should be completely neutral, but he, supposedly a public servant, actively stood against the will of the public that he was there to serve. He said that he was given to understand that he would be honoured at the end of his tenure, although he'd been advised a while back that he would be unlikely to receive one given his conduct. And for him to now be recommended by Corbyn in the Labour Party, given that it's them he was helping, really is no great surprise. So taking everything into account, character and conduct, my firm belief is that you, John Bercow, deserve nothing. You're a nasty little man, and you acted against the will of those you're there to serve. So jog on. Ask the EU for an honour. And with that, I'll end this video there. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like as it really helps, and if you want to hear more, you can subscribe. Plus, I recently found out that I get very excited when people leave comments, so if you want to leave a comment and let me know what you think, it'd be great to get some feedback. Until the next time, stay safe.